Racist cop slaps a quiet black woman. He had no idea she was the judge. They thought the courtroom was theirs. They thought silence would protect them. But then a single slap shattered it all. A corrupt cop, a hidden network of lies, and a black female judge who refused to bow. This isn't just a case. It's a reckoning, and once the truth starts to rise, not even power can stop it. Now ask yourself, what would you do if justice stood alone? Let's begin. Racist cop slaps quiet black woman in court. She's the judge. The courthouse was already awake, but barely. The marble walls stood tall and cold like silent witnesses to centuries of justice and injustice. Morning light pushed through narrow windows, painting the courtroom pews in long golden stripes. Everything looked ordinary, but something under the surface pulsed with tension. A teenage black boy sat hunched beside his public defender at the defense table. His shoulders were drawn up like he was bracing for something. His eyes darted around the room. He wasn't used to places like this. And places like this weren't made to welcome boys like him. A few reporters settled into their benches, notepads open, brows lifted with mild curiosity. The prosecutor's side was quiet, except for one figure standing rigid, arms crossed, lips tight. Sergeant Travis Boone, a third-generation cop in Charleston. Clean-shaven, crew-cut, badge polished. The kind of man who carried his uniform like a shield and a weapon. Everybody in the system knew him. Everybody had heard the rumors, but nothing ever stuck. Misconduct reports disappeared. Complaints dissolved before they made it to paper. He smiled in photos, smirked in court, and walked like someone who believed no one could ever touch him. He didn't see her walk in. She wasn't wearing her robe, just a simple charcoal blouse tucked into gray slacks. Silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun. Her steps were slow, deliberate, unbothered. To the untrained eye, she might have looked like a clerk, or maybe just another lawyer, but her presence had gravity. She carried something bigger than the room could name. She stopped at the side table, picked up a file, flipped it open without a word. Boone didn't like being ignored. He turned to the clerk. "Let's get this started," he snapped. "I don't have all day." A quiet voice answered from across the room. "Then I suggest you make the time." He turned toward the voice, his frown deepening. His eyes squinted at the woman with the file. "You here for the defense?" he asked, half laughing. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Boone took a step forward, boots hitting the courtroom floor harder than needed. His voice rose with it. "I'm talking to you." Still, she didn't respond. Another step, this time closer. "I said I'm talking to—" A crack split the room, his hand. Her cheek, the sound echoed, sharp and sudden. It sliced through the room like a whip. The courtroom froze. A journalist dropped their pen. A lawyer gasped. The teenager at the defense table recoiled in his chair. Even the air felt still. Clara didn't move. Her cheek reddened from the slap, but she didn't lift her hand to it. She didn't step back. She didn't blink. She just turned. Slowly. Her eyes locked onto Boone's face like twin blades. He stepped back. For a second, he looked surprised by what he'd done. And then, without remorse, he muttered under his breath, "You people need to learn some respect." Someone in the back whispered, "Oh my God." Another voice said, "Is she okay?" But she wasn't looking for sympathy. She was looking at Boone, and Boone was still blind. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he said, frustrated. Clara took one step forward, then another. The room started to shift. Something unspoken had just turned. A ripple moved through the crowd. The clerk's mouth parted in silent realization. One of the officers at the back tensed. "She's not in her robe," someone whispered. Boone didn't hear it. He was too busy trying to keep control of a situation he didn't understand anymore. "I asked you a question," he barked. Clara raised her head. "Is this how you treat officers of the court, Sergeant?" The blood drained from the clerk's face. Boone blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" She moved toward the platform, slowly, purposefully. And then she stepped behind the bench. She turned, faced him, and sat down. There was no robe. No gavel yet, but everyone in that room now understood who she was. Judge Clara May. Boone stood frozen. She laced her fingers together and looked at him with eyes that had seen 3 decades of quiet injustice and had stayed standing. "Sergeant Boone," she said. Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of an avalanche. "Did you just strike me in this courtroom?" He stammered. I didn't know who you were." "That's not what I asked. Did you put your hand on me?" He opened his mouth. "Answer the question, yes or no." A camera phone flicked on in the back. The red light blinked. Another started recording. Silence fell again. Boone puffed up, trying to take back control. "You weren't in your robe," he said. "You thought I was beneath you," Clara replied. Her tone didn't rise. It didn't have to. His jaw tightened. "You're twisting this." "I'm stating facts." She leaned forward, voice sharpening. "You assaulted a black woman, unprovoked, in open court, and now your only defense is that you didn't know who I was." He said nothing. "If I were a white male judge standing here, robe or not, would you have raised your hand?" Still silence. Clara turned to the clerk. "Let the record reflect that Sergeant Travis Boone has admitted to striking a sitting judge in a courtroom without cause." Boone looked toward the back of the courtroom. Officers stood still. No one moved. No allies stepped forward. The room had already chosen a side, and it wasn't his. Clara's voice dropped to a level just above a whisper, but it cut deeper than any shout. "Officer Mills," she said, turning to the bailiff, "is this courtroom currently under surveillance?" "Yes, Your Honor, audio and visual." "Good, then the record will reflect both." For the first time, Boone looked scared, not embarrassed, not annoyed. Truly scared. He glanced toward the ceiling, eyes catching the faint red glow of the security camera lights. That was when the gavel finally fell, and everything he thought was untouchable began to unravel. Judge calls out racist cop in court. He's not ready for her. The room had gone quiet but not empty. You could hear the fluorescent hum in the ceiling, the distant whir of a fax machine down the hallway, and the shallow breaths of people too stunned to move. Judge Clara May sat high on the bench now, her posture straight but not rigid. Her hands folded gently before her, but her presence pressed down on the courtroom like a storm cloud building heat. She wasn't yelling. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any outrage. Sergeant Boone stood stiff, his lips pressed into a tight line. The flush on his cheeks deepened under the weight of every eye fixed on him. There was no badge big enough now to hide behind, no rank that could erase what had just happened. Clara let the silence stretch, not out of cruelty, but clarity, letting everyone in that room feel the gravity of the moment. The truth was no longer subtle. It was alive, breathing, unavoidable. She finally spoke. "Sergeant Boone," she said, her voice firm but even, "explain to this court what made you believe that placing your hand on another person, on any person, in this courtroom was appropriate." He didn't answer right away. His tongue wet his bottom lip. He looked left, then right, as if hoping someone would step in. "I didn't recognize you," he muttered. "That's not an answer," Clara said. "That's a deflection." He shifted on his feet. "You weren't wearing your robe. You were just standing there, going through files. I thought you were one of the clerks. And that gave you the right to strike me." "No, I didn't mean to." "Oh, but you did." She leaned slightly forward. "You made a decision, not by accident, not by reflex, by choice." "I thought you were someone being disrespectful," he said, voice tightening. Clara didn't flinch. "You mean you thought I was someone unimportant?" The air thickened. He blinked, swallowed. You thought I was beneath you, she continued, and so your instinct was to use force. I reacted, Boone snapped, raising his voice now. I was doing my job. That boy you brought in, he's a thug. I caught him with spray paint. He was tagging walls, probably part of a gang. Clara's gavel came down, sharp and final. Enough. Her voice rose now, the restraint giving way to righteous command. You do not get to justify assault by pointing at a child. She turned to the court reporter. Miss Harper, enter into the record. Sergeant Travis Boone attempted to justify the physical assault of a judge by referencing a separate juvenile case in which the judge had no direct involvement at the time of the incident. Harper nodded, her fingers flying across the keys. Clara shifted her gaze back to Boone. This wasn't just misconduct. This was an act of aggression rooted in arrogance, driven by assumption. He clenched his fists at his sides. I don't care who you are, he said under his breath. You don't get to stand in my way. Clara tilted her head slightly. I'm not in your way, I'm in your path. And the difference is, you're the one who walked into this courtroom believing no one could stop you. Her voice softened, but the steel in it remained. You've spent years in this city walking through doors black men weren't allowed to stand in front of. You wore your father's badge like a crown and passed judgment on lives you didn't care to understand. She paused, but today the room didn't belong to you. Boone looked down at the floor for the first time, not out of shame, but calculation. He glanced at the two officers still standing by the courtroom wall. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. Clara saw it. The silence you're hearing now, she said, it isn't confusion, it's realization. They've seen what I've seen. She turned to the bailiff. Officer Mills, is this courtroom under video surveillance? Yes, Your Honor, multiple angles, audio synced. Good, then this record will remain intact. Clara turned back to Boone, now quiet again. You've had 20 years of not meaning it, she said. I've read your record, I've seen the complaints. 5 in the last 7 years alone. Excessive force, racial profiling, witness intimidation, each one mysteriously closed, no action taken, not even a reprimand. Boone opened his mouth to interrupt, but Clara raised a hand. You're not here to speak, you're here to listen. The room was still again. I've spent a lifetime watching men like you mistake volume for authority, mistake a badge for moral standing, mistake fear for respect. She stood, and that ends today. The sound of her shoes against the hardwood platform was soft, but final. In accordance with the authority vested in me as a circuit judge for the state of South Carolina, she declared, this courtroom is now the scene of a judicial assault. Under Title 16, Chapter 3, Article 1, I am placing you, Sergeant Travis Boone, under formal investigation for criminal assault of a public official. Gasps rippled from the back of the room. Clara turned to Officer Mills. Escort Sergeant Boone to holding. Do not cuff him in front of the press, but ensure he is not allowed to leave this building. Boone stepped back, mouth open. You can't be serious, he said. You're going to ruin my life over a misunderstanding. Clara met his eyes, her voice dropping to a whisper. You ruined it yourself the moment your hand met my face. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a creak. The bailiff approached Boone slowly. No one stopped it. No one interrupted. The system that had protected him for years had gone silent, and for the first time in his career, Sergeant Travis Boone had no shield left to hide behind. Only consequences. Court cameras catch cop assaulting judge, now she strikes back. The walls of the courthouse had seen things before, pleas, betrayals, confessions whispered just under breath, but never this. Not a judge standing tall after being struck, and not the system watching, stunned, as one of its own began to unravel. Sergeant Boone sat in the holding room now, just down the hall. The lights buzzed above him, cold and flickering. His hands rested on his thighs, twitching occasionally. Not from guilt, from disbelief. For the first time in 2 decades, he wasn't giving orders, he was waiting. Outside, the courtroom remained half-filled. Reporters whispered. Clerks made quiet calls. One defense attorney tapped his pen nervously against his notebook, eyes scanning the doors like something else was about to explode. Judge Clara May had returned to her chambers, but not to retreat. She stood at the window, her back straight, one hand pressed against the glass. Down below, a small crowd had begun to form. Word had already started to spread. Whispers traveled fast in Charleston. Faster when they carried the scent of scandal and justice colliding. The knock came soft but firm. Carter Lang, her bailiff of nearly 10 years, entered the room. "They've secured Boone, holding room B," he said. Clara turned slowly. Her voice was calm but firm. "Make sure the footage is backed up." Carter nodded. "Already done, 3 angles, audio and visual. We've got it all." Clara stepped back to her desk and opened a slim folder. Inside, a list of names, officers, prosecutors, court clerks, each one connected to complaints tied to Boone. Some crossed out, others circled, none forgotten. She looked up. Pull everything tied to him, arrest records, incident reports. Any case where his name shows up as arresting officer or witness. Carter hesitated. "That's 10 years of files." Her gaze didn't move. "Then we'd better get started." Downstairs, 2 internal affairs officers had arrived. One was a no-nonsense black woman in her 40s, Agent Rosalind Keene. The other, a younger Latino man with sharp eyes and quiet presence, Agent Felix Reyes. Both walked through the side entrance, badges already in hand. They weren't here for small talk. Carter met them halfway. "They're waiting," he said. The agents followed him in silence through the rear corridor. No press, no chatter. Just the hum of a building realizing it was about to be turned inside out. When Keene entered Clara's chambers, she didn't shake hands. She opened her file, placed it on the desk, and spoke plainly. "We've been watching Boone for a while. His record's too clean for someone that dirty." Clara nodded. "I know." Reyes leaned in. "But every complaint, missing evidence, no witnesses willing to testify, body cam footage redacted, paper trails vanish before they reach command." Keene slid over a printed still from courtroom security. "Not this time." The photo showed Boone mid-motion, his hand extended, Clara's face visible, her expression unreadable. Her spine straight, her dignity unbroken. "You want to press charges?" Keene asked. Clara didn't blink. "I want a full investigation. Internal, external, federal if necessary, and I want it to start now." Reyes nodded. "Consider it open." That afternoon, a sealed subpoena was sent to the Charleston PD's data archives. A request for all footage, all records, all complaints with Boone's signature or initials. Clara stood in her office, staring at the image on her monitor. Her own face, frozen in a moment of violence she hadn't asked for but refused to bury. She turned to Carter. "They think this was about a slap." He stayed silent, waiting. "They don't realize," she said, voice dropping into something deeper. "They just walked into a trap I've been laying for 20 years." And outside the courthouse walls, the system that had long closed its eyes to injustice finally began to blink. The footage would not disappear. The silence would not return. Because this time the judge was ready. And she wasn't the one on trial. Judge uncovers 10 years of hidden police abuse files. By sunrise, the courthouse was quiet but humming. The kind of quiet that doesn't mean peace but pressure. Behind locked office doors, a war was beginning, not with fists but with files. Judge Clara May sat at the long oak table in her chambers, the windows behind her still dark. A yellow legal pad lay open in front of her, already filled halfway with notes written in her sharp, architectural script. A black coffee sat untouched. She hadn't come here to sip and reflect. She came to dig. Across from her sat Agent Rosalind Keene and Agent Felix Reyes, both federal, both focused, neither blinking. Keene placed a fresh stack of papers on the table. Here are the first 9 complaints filed against Boone over the last decade, most dismissed, some vanished completely. Clara didn't even glance up. She flipped through them, her finger running down the lines like she already knew what she would find. Different handwriting, she said softly, tapping one internal memo. But the same language, insufficient evidence to proceed. A same sentence in 6 different years. Like it was copy-pasted, Reyes muttered. She nodded. And signed by the same internal review officer. Agent Keene opened a separate folder. That officer's name is Whitaker, retired last year. But every dismissal he signed leads back to a small circle of command staff who are still active. Clara leaned back in her chair, the weight of years resting on her shoulders. These names, do they overlap with anyone in the DA's office? Reyes nodded. 1. Ada Carson Ramsey. He was lead prosecutor in 5 of Boone's cases where body cam footage was missing, never filed charges. Clara didn't speak. Her eyes just narrowed. Something behind them moved, like a storm building behind stained glass. Carter stepped into the room then, carrying another box. These came from the 3rd-floor records room, he said. Some weren't in digital, paper only. Locked in a cabinet labeled inactive. He placed the box on the table. Clara pulled open the lid. Inside were sealed manila envelopes, some yellowed with time, others freshly marked but never processed. She opened one. A complaint from a black teenager arrested at a gas station by Boone in 2017. Broken wrist, photos attached, medical report consistent with blunt trauma, no arrest made, no charges filed against Boone. Another envelope, 2019. A young woman pulled over at 2 a.m. Cam request marked as not available. Her written statement was stapled inside. He said, "No one will believe you. I'm the one with the badge." Clara closed her eyes briefly, not out of fatigue, out of restraint. Then she looked at the agents. "I want a list, every case where Boone testified, every arrest he made, every complaint filed even if it went nowhere. And I want that list cross-checked with every Ada who handled prosecution." Agent Keene pulled out her tablet and started typing. Clara turned to Carter. "I want you to pull Ramsey's appearances in my courtroom. Anything in the last 10 years. I want to know what he said, what he filed, and what he buried." Carter gave a low nod. "It's going to be a long night." Clara looked down at her yellow pad. The notes were no longer just bullet points. They were a map. "This isn't just Boone," she said quietly. "This is how the system survives itself, one missing tape, one closed case, one not enough evidence at a time." Reyes leaned back in his chair. "You think it's bigger?" She looked at him. "I think he's the smell, not the rot." Outside, the early sun began to rise over Charleston. But inside that room, light was already being dragged into the shadows. One file at a time, and the core was starting to crack. Police files mysteriously disappear, but Judge connects the dots. The records room smelled like dust, old paper, and something else, silence. The kind of silence that hides things, not the quiet of peace, but of neglect. Clara stood at the center of it, surrounded by rows of steel cabinets reaching floor to ceiling. Their drawers were labeled by year, by district, by case number. But behind those labels were names, stories. Cries for help that had never been answered. Carter wheeled in another cart stacked high with folders. Half of these were never scanned. Some don't even have tracking numbers. Clara didn't look up, because someone didn't want them to be found. Agent Keene appeared at the doorway, holding a folder marked closed, but inside nothing was resolved. This one's from 2015. Young black man, arrested by Boone. Excessive force complaint filed. Internal Affairs requested body cam. The file says it was corrupted in transfer. Clara opened the folder. The complaint was typed, clean, restrained. He slammed my head against the car after I was cuffed. I told him I couldn't breathe. He said, "You can breathe enough to talk." She stared at the paper for a moment, then closed the file. "Do we know who handled the prosecution?" Ray stepped forward, holding a tablet. "Ada Carson Ramsey, again." Clara didn't need confirmation. Her gut had already drawn the line. What did he do? Filed the charges against the victim, resisting arrest. The complaint against Boone was marked inconclusive. No further action. Clara moved to the nearest cabinet and pulled a drawer. It screeched like something trying to wake up after years of sleep. Inside were files stacked neatly, almost too neatly. She grabbed one at random. 2018, graffiti case. Minor defendant, arrested by Boone. Charges dropped, but no reasoning filed. She flipped the cover. The arrest report had been redacted. The digital log noted footage unavailable. Carter stood behind her. "I've seen this pattern 5 times now. Boone arrests someone. The story gets shaky. Ada Ramsey either drops the charges or pressures a plea. Then the complaint disappears." Clara nodded slowly. The cases didn't collapse, they were buried. Agent Keene walked over with a flash drive. "We found something else." She plugged it into her tablet. On screen, a spreadsheet appeared. Names, dates, complaint codes, signatures. Detective Whitaker approved the dismissal of every complaint tied to Boone. Clara leaned in, and Whitaker was Boone's training officer. Keene nodded, which means every file he reviewed was, in essence, protecting his own legacy. Carter added, and Ramsey prosecuted most of Boone's arrests, meaning any evidence missing from those cases went through his office. Ray scrolled down on his tablet. "Wait, look at this." In 2020, a journalist requested footage from a 2019 arrest involving Boone. The request was denied. Reason given: no footage available due to technical malfunction. Clara whispered, "What journalist?" Ray's read the name aloud, Julia Spence. The room went still. Carter turned sharply. "She's the one who died last year, car accident. They said it was a sleeping pill overdose." Keene raised her eyes. She was investigating police misconduct before her death. Clara stared at the cabinet in front of her, breathing slow and deep. Then she reached for a sticky note and wrote the name Julia Spence in thick capital letters. Then she looked up. "We're not just dealing with a crooked cop. We're dealing with a system that swallowed the people who tried to expose it." She stepped back from the cabinet, her voice low. "Start building the map. Boone, Ramsey, Whitaker. Any city official with ties to them. Phone logs, donation records, closed case reviews. If their names appear more than once, I want them highlighted." Ray said quietly, "This is going to get ugly." Clara didn't blink. Good. Maybe it's finally time this city saw what ugly looks like when you stop dressing it in blue. And just like that, the ghosts in the file room began to speak. They hadn't been forgotten. They'd been waiting. Judge gets threat about her nephew. Now it's personal. The morning light filtered through the blinds in narrow beams, slicing across the floor of Clara's chambers like quiet warnings. The air felt still, too still for a building full of noise and motion. She sat at her desk, files open, red pen in hand, but her mind wasn't in the ink. It was in the silence. A buzz vibrated against the wood. Her phone lit up. No contact, just a number. She opened the message. Nice house in Mount Pleasant. Does your nephew still bike home from school? Clara froze. The screen glowed cold in her palm. She read the words again, slower this time. Every syllable felt like a needle pressing into skin. She stood without a word, walked to the door, and turned the lock. Carter looked up from across the room. He knew that look. What's wrong? She handed him the phone. His eyes narrowed as he read. Then his voice dropped low, hard. That son of a... Don't, Clara said, voice controlled. Don't give it oxygen. Carter paced, fists clenched. That's your nephew, Clara. They crossed a line. She walked to the window, stared out over the street. The usual traffic, a few reporters loitering by the front steps. Nothing looked out of place, but everything had changed. I want my nephew pulled from school, she said calmly. Quietly, I want eyes on my sister's house within the hour. No uniforms, no marked cars. Carter was already dialing. Done. Clara turned back to her desk. Her fingers trembled for just a moment as she opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a black leather binder, thick, sealed, private. She placed it on the desk and flipped it open. Inside were years of notes, names, whispers she never said out loud. Patterns she had documented but never used. Until now, an hour later, she was inside a federal building downtown. A gray box of concrete and cameras where sunlight didn't reach and secrets didn't escape. 3 U.S. Marshals sat across from her in a windowless room. She slid a printed photo across the table, her nephew, taken from a distance. Backpack slung over one shoulder, his face turned toward home. This was sent to me this morning. No sender, no trace, just a message. The lead marshal, a man named Mercer, examined it. You're certain this was Boone? Clara's voice didn't waver. I'm certain it came from someone protecting him. And that means he's not just a problem. He's a weapon being used by something bigger. What exactly are you asking for? Clara leaned forward, eyes steady. I want federal custody for Boone, protective detail for my family. And I want every single case tied to his name frozen for independent review. One of the DOJ officials shifted in his seat. That's going to shake the courts for months. Clara met his gaze, unblinking, then let them shake. Back at the courthouse, word moved like wind. Something had changed. Clara wasn't just investigating now, she was under threat. And still she moved through the halls with the same quiet strength. Coat draped over her shoulders, eyes forward. Every step deliberate. Agent Keene met her outside the district records room. We traced the burner phone. Boone used it twice last night. One call went to a number registered under a shell company in Atlanta. And the second. Keene's expression darkened. To a lobbying firm tied to your mayor's re-election campaign. Clara's jaw tensed. So this reaches beyond the courtroom. Way beyond, Keene said. Ray's arrived with a tablet in hand. We flagged the shell company. It's popped up before. First in a corruption probe 3 years ago, buried. And again 6 weeks ago, financial audit triggered by a local journalist. Clara's breath caught. Julia Spence. Keene nodded. She requested files on Boone, disappeared 2 days later. Car found outside the city, ruled an overdose. But she didn't have a history of drug use. No, she had a history of exposing corrupt cops. Clara stepped back. The air around her had shifted again, heavier now, like the city was leaning against her, trying to see if she'd bend. She didn't. Find me everything she was working on, Clara said. Every article, every contact. If there's a thread she was pulling, we pull it until the wall comes down. Keene hesitated. This may go deeper than we can measure. Clara's voice was quiet but firm. I'm counting on it. And for the first time since the slap heard round the courtroom, the system began to look afraid of her. Not because she was loud, but because she was coming, and she wasn't coming alone. U.S. Marshals hunt dirty cop Boone as powerful allies crack. The heat had settled low over Charleston, thick like sweat on the skin of a city trying to hide its sins. But this time, the sins were running scared. Sergeant Boone was gone. Disappeared just before dawn, his apartment empty, his badge left behind like an insult, drawers stripped, surveillance cameras disabled. The only thing left was a black coffee cooling on his kitchen counter. As if he had paused one last time, daring the law to find him. By 9 a.m. the hunt was on. U.S. Marshals flooded the city in unmarked sedans. Quiet, efficient, deadly focused. No press briefings, no televised manhunt. Just boots hitting pavement and warrants sliding under doors. Inside a government operations room downtown, digital maps glowed with live pings. Boone's credit cards, phone records, traffic cameras, gas station security feeds. But every trace led nowhere. He knew we were coming, Agent Mercer said, staring at the red dot blinking out on the screen. Someone tipped him. Clara stood behind him, arms folded, calm but boiling inside. It wasn't just a tip, she said. It was cover. Mercer looked at her. You think he had help? She didn't flinch. I think he's never made a move alone in his life. Meanwhile, across the city, a name surfaced. Chief Bradley Hands. A man who'd worn the uniform longer than most had been alive. Praised in the press. Decorated. Untouchable. But Clara knew better. Because his name had appeared 3 times in the files tied to Boone, not in bold print but in the margins. Handwritten initials, approvals signed without a trace, suppression orders on footage Boone claimed had malfunctioned. She pointed to his name in the document. He's the leak. Keene nodded. We serve him today. Clara shook her head. No, we expose him. That afternoon, Clara called an emergency meeting with the city's Judicial Ethics Board, her voice steady, her hands still. I am not asking for a courtesy, she said. I am giving you notice. Every case tied to Boone, to Ada Ramsey, to Chief Hands, will be reviewed. If I find one shred of tampering, it will be brought to federal light. One of the older members scoffed. You're making this very public, Judge May. She met his eyes. Good. Back on the street, Boone kept moving. First to a motel in North Charleston, then out again before midnight. Security footage showed him in a black hoodie, cash in hand. No phone, no car. Someone was driving him. By morning, he was 3 counties west, hiding behind the gates of a private hunting lodge owned by an old friend of the mayor. No cameras, no cell towers, just woods, rifles, and silence. But the marshals were closing in. Rays traced a transaction, gas purchase, unregistered vehicle, 30 minutes out. Mercer turned to his team. Move now, quiet, fast. That night, 6 unmarked vehicles rolled through the back roads under cover of trees. A drone hovered above. Thermal scans confirmed movement inside the lodge. 2 heat signatures. One was pacing. As the team breached the door, Boone reached for a pistol on the nightstand, but the lights burst on before he could grip it. Don't, said the marshal in the doorway. Boone froze. Hands went up, mouth shut. The fight in his body drained fast because he knew this wasn't street power anymore. This was federal. By dawn, Boone was in custody. Shackled, transported. No press, no announcement, but the news broke anyway. An anonymous leak to a local journalist, just one phone. Boone in cuffs, eyes down, walking out of the woods. Within hours, social media lit up. Hashtags spread. Protesters returned to the courthouse steps, and quietly behind closed doors, 3 senior city officials filed early retirement. Clara stood in her office, watching it all unfold. Carter stepped beside her. "You really think they're done?" Clara didn't answer right away. She stared at the photo again. "No," she said finally. "They're just realizing the rules changed." And in the city that once silenced stories like hers, the silence had cracked, loud enough for the whole country to hear. Judge names dirty officials on live TV. Crowd goes silent. The marble steps outside the courthouse had never felt this heavy. By noon, every inch of stone was swallowed by bodies, students, elders, mothers holding cardboard signs with trembling hands. News vans lined the avenue like soldiers. Microphones stood at attention. The air was hot, but the tension was hotter. Everyone was waiting for one woman. Judge Clara May stepped through the courthouse doors, her black robe flowing behind her like a shadow with purpose. No bodyguards, no handlers, just her standing tall, flanked by truth and silence. A hush fell like a curtain. She stopped at the podium. No teleprompter, no prepared statement, only a folder in her hand. She opened it, looked up, and spoke. "I have stood in that courtroom behind me for 13 years. I have sworn in officers. I have heard their testimonies. I have read their reports, and I believed them." Her voice cracked just slightly, but she didn't pause. "I believed them until the truth showed me I couldn't afford to." Cameras clicked like firecrackers. Reporters leaned forward. She held up the first page. "This is a suppression order signed in 2019 by Ada Carson Ramsey for a case involving unlawful force. Evidence, body cam footage, was sealed from both prosecution and defense. The victim was 17. She turned the page. "This is a communication log. Chief Hands ordered 2 internal affairs complaints dismissed without formal review. Both involved the same officer." She let the silence stretch. "That officer's name is Franklin Boone." The crowd murmured. She continued. "For the past 10 years, a circle of power, spanning law enforcement, prosecution, and city leadership, has operated not to protect the public, but to protect each other. They've erased evidence, buried complaints, and endangered innocent lives. And I will not be silent about it." She raised her eyes, sharp and unwavering. "I have filed a formal request for a public ethics tribunal. I will testify. Under oath, I have submitted every file, every name, and every timestamp to federal investigators. There will be no sealed doors, no backroom apologies, not this time." A voice from the press shouted, "Judge May, are you saying the mayor knew?" Clara didn't flinch. "I am saying the mayor received campaign donations from the same shell companies that paid for Boone's legal defense. I am saying those companies are under investigation." The crowd gasped. Another voice called out, "Is your life in danger?" She looked directly into the lens of the nearest camera. "If it is, then it's only proof that I'm walking the right path." Applause erupted, slow at first, then rising like a wave. Chants began to build from the steps. Justice for Julia, justice for the silenced, justice for all. Behind Clara, Carter stood quietly, eyes locked on the crowd. His face tight with pride. Keene leaned toward him and whispered, "She just set fire to their whole system." Carter nodded. She didn't just light the match, she brought the gasoline. Inside the courthouse, emails were already being deleted. Phone calls made in whispers. Resignation letters drafted with shaking fingers, but it was too late. Clara had said their names out loud, and the people were listening. Smear campaign targets judge after she names corrupt officials. It began with whispers on morning radio. Then came the blogs, then the headlines. Judge Clara May under ethics review. Whispers turned into roars in the comment sections. Her name swirled through gossip websites, anonymous forums, and digital flyers passed hand to hand like poison. Photos taken from years ago, twisted out of context. One showing her at a protest, arm raised in unity, now labeled anti-police radical. At first, she ignored it, but then came the bots. Thousands of accounts, no profile pictures, no followers, posting the same sentence over and over again beneath every news clip and interview. She's not a judge. She's an activist in a robe. By the end of the week, a fabricated story appeared on a national site. Anonymous source claims Judge May pressured witnesses in 2016 trial. Carter stormed into her office with his phone in hand. This is a hit job. These aren't leaks. They're lies. Clara looked up from her desk, calm but weary. They're scared. He dropped the phone on her desk. And now they want the public to be scared of you. Later that night, she logged into her personal email. There were 50 new messages. Most were hate. Some were threats. One read, "You're not untouchable. Your nephew bleeds like anyone else." She leaned back in her chair, breathing deep. The silence of her home no longer felt peaceful, it felt watched. The curtains stayed drawn, her porch lights stayed on. Outside, a black SUV parked across the street. Same spot 2 nights in a row, no plates, windows tinted. Carter sat inside his car down the block, phone in hand. "You think she's scared?" he said to Keene over the line. Keene answered, "She's not built to run." In public, Clara stood tall, but in private, her sister's voice trembled. "We can leave town for a while," she whispered through the phone. "Take the boys somewhere safe." Clara replied softly, "I won't let them chase us from truth, but I won't let them hurt you either." She made the call that night. "Put my family on federal protection," she told Mercer. "It's already done," he replied. "They've also traced the smear campaign. It's being run through a PR firm that services multiple political clients, including the mayor's office." Clara closed her eyes for a moment. And the bots? Out of state, funded, intentional. They're trying to bury you before this tribunal happens. She nodded slowly. "Then we speak louder." At church that Sunday, Clara stood before her community, not in robes, not behind a bench, but in a simple black dress. She didn't read from a script. She spoke from soul. "They want to drown my voice in static. But my voice isn't just mine. It belongs to every black mother whose son was cuffed without cause. To every father who was silenced in a courtroom that wasn't built for his defense. To every child who grew up thinking justice was for someone else." The congregation stood with her, tears on faces, hands raised. Voices whispered her name, not in fear, but in faith. When she stepped outside, reporters waited. But this time, so did neighbors, teachers, retirees, former defendants, all standing shoulder to shoulder. Carter leaned in and whispered, "You just took back the narrative." Clara answered, "I didn't take it back, they gave it to me. Because they've seen what fear looks like. Now they're ready to see what courage does." And as the smear campaign roared online, the streets told a different story. Clara wasn't losing support. She was becoming something the system couldn't handle. A black woman the people believed in. Boone's arrest sparks collapse of corrupt power network. The morning Boone appeared in federal court, the sky over Charleston was slate gray. The air held no wind, but something had shifted. Streets were quieter. Journalists lined the courthouse steps in clusters. They weren't there for him. They were there for what was about to fall with him. Inside the courtroom, Boone sat shackled, not just cuffed, shackled at wrists and ankles like the threat he was. He wore a plain tan jumpsuit, but his eyes still carried defiance. Not fear, yet. Clara entered through the side door, escorted by 2 federal agents. She didn't look at Boone, she looked at the bench. Then at the room full of people who had once ignored the whispers she tried to raise. The tribunal began. A federal ethics judge presided. We are here to determine the depth of misconduct and conspiracy within the Charleston law enforcement and judicial system. Judge Clara May, you may proceed with your testimony. Clara stood. No notes, no legal team, just her voice. I was told to believe in the system, but what I found was a system that believed in its own protection more than in the people it was sworn to serve. She turned to the gallery, reporters scribbled, cameras clicked. I will not offer summaries today, I will speak plainly, names, dates, files. The judge nodded. Continue. Clara stepped closer. Franklin Boone arrested. Tied to at least 16 sealed complaints of excessive force. None reviewed publicly. 4 victims never received trial. 2 of them were minors. A few gasps echoed. She turned a page. Carson Ramsey, former assistant district attorney, ordered suppression of footage involving Boone in 2018, 2020, and 2022. Personally approved witness disqualifications in cases that should have gone federal. She locked eyes with the ethics board. Chief Bradley Hands received internal complaints on Boone, forwarded them to private legal advisors instead of internal affairs, violated both state and federal policy. Evidence confirmed through audit logs and whistleblower testimony. She laid the folder down. These are not allegations, these are facts, and if you hesitate to act, then you're not protecting the system, you're protecting rot. The room went silent. Then a voice broke through. Do you have any proof connecting these officials to each other? Clara didn't blink. Financial records, coordinated campaign donations, shared defense attorneys, matching timestamps on sealed case orders, and one audio file captured last year, where Boone referred to himself as untouchable because, quote, the top is already bought in. A pin could have dropped. Suddenly the door opened. A court officer whispered something to the judge. The judge cleared his throat. We've just received confirmation. The mayor has formally resigned, citing medical leave. Whispers spread like wildfire. Clara didn't react. Her eyes stayed fixed. Another officer approached the bench. Ada Ramsey has turned himself in. He's requesting full immunity for cooperation. The judge turned to Clara. You started a domino. She answered without pride. No. I just stopped pretending the tower wasn't crooked. Outside the courthouse, protesters erupted in cheers. Boone was escorted out the side. No more swagger in his step. No more fire in his stare. Just a man reduced to what he always was beneath the badge. Another bully who thought the system would protect him forever. But the system had turned. And Clara, she didn't look back because this wasn't her victory alone. It was justice for every voice that had been ignored, silenced, or buried. And for the first time in a long time, Charleston felt like it could breathe again. Judge Clara May resigns with a final blow to injustice. The courtroom was quiet. Not because it was empty, but because everyone inside could feel something was about to end. And something bigger was about to begin. Judge Clara May walked in without her robe. No black cloth, no badge of office. Just a navy blue blazer over a white blouse and a quiet strength that filled the space louder than any gavel ever could. She stood at the same podium where she once sentenced men to prison, where she once was told to stay in line, to stay quiet, to not ask questions. But now the city watched her, not as a judge, but as a woman who had faced down giants and never blinked. She looked out across the chamber. Reporters, law students, elders from her neighborhood, survivors of the very system she helped expose. Carter sat in the first row, hands folded. Behind him, a woman wiped tears from her cheeks. 2 seats down, a teenage boy held a sign that simply read, "Because of you, I still believe." Clara took a breath. I was never meant to stay behind this bench forever. Silence wrapped around every word. I came into this system believing I could make it better from within. I tried, but I learned justice does not move unless it's pushed. Truth does not rise unless it's carried. She paused, her eyes finding the young boy, S. And change does not happen unless someone is willing to be the storm. She stepped back slightly. Today I resign from my position as circuit court judge. Not in shame, not in fear, but in fulfillment. My fight here is done. And now it is time for new voices, louder, braver, younger, to carry the torch forward. The room held its breath. A reporter called out softly, "So what now, Judge May?" She looked at him. "I'm not leaving justice. I'm just changing where I fight." Another voice, hesitant but hopeful, asked, "Do you regret any of this?" She shook her head slowly. "I regret only the years I stayed silent when I knew better, but now the silence is broken." She stepped away from the podium. The applause didn't come quickly. It came like a rising wave, deep, heartfelt, unstoppable. Outside, the crowd waiting on the courthouse steps erupted when she walked out, not in fanfare, but in reverence. Carter met her at the doors. "You sure about this?" he asked. Clara looked out at the faces lifted toward her. "I'm more than sure," she said. "I'm ready." He smiled. "They're gonna ask you to run for something, you know." She smiled back. "Let them ask. This time I won't wait for permission." And with that, Clara walked down the steps, not as a judge, but as a force that no system could silence, no smear could erase. A woman who stood for the forgot and left a legacy no gavel could hold. A final verdict not written in law, but in courage, and the city she fought for was finally ready to rise with her. Clara May's legacy inspires a new generation of justice. The afternoon sun poured through the tall windows of the community center. The hardwood floor still smelled like lemon oil and old books. Children laughed down the hallway, their voices bouncing off walls painted with murals of Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and now, one more. On the east wall stood a fresh painting. A woman in a navy coat, her eyes strong, her shoulders squared, standing on courthouse steps. Beneath her image were the words, "Justice is a seed, truth is the rain." Clara stood quietly in front of it. She didn't say much. She never liked attention. But in this room, with children spinning in circles and high school students practicing debate in the corner, she could feel the change blooming. Behind her, her sister walked in with two little boys in tow. "Mama," one of them shouted. Clara turned, dropping to her knees. "Come here, baby," she whispered, opening her arms. They ran into her like she was the safest place on earth, and for them she was. Later that day, Clara visited a law school in Charleston. The auditorium was packed. Students leaned forward, notebooks open, eyes wide. A young black woman stood during Q&A. "Judge May, Miss Clara, how did you know when it was time to speak?" Clara looked up at her, when the silence felt heavier than the truth. The girl nodded, holding back tears. In the back row, one professor whispered to another, "You know she changed the bar exam this year. There's now a whole section on ethical whistleblowing. That wasn't there before." In another part of town, the old Boone trials were being reopened. One man, wrongly convicted at 19, now 34, walked free. His mother fell to her knees on the courthouse steps. "They tried to bury us," she cried, "but they didn't know we were seeds." Carter watched it unfold on the news, then sent Clara a picture of the scene. No caption, just a photo. She smiled, sitting at her kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea. Her robe now hung in the back of her closet, pressed, untouched. But her mission, still moving, because her name was being spoken in classrooms, in sermons, in city halls, in whispered prayers and shouted protests. She had become more than a judge. She had become a memory that pushed people forward. A street was renamed in her honor. Clara May Way, right outside the courthouse she once stood in, right where Boone was arrested. And at night, when the lights dimmed and the house settled, Clara would step onto her porch, look up at the stars, and feel something warm move through her chest. She didn't need a title anymore. She had something far stronger: legacy. And somewhere out there, a little black girl was holding a gavel made of plastic and whispering to her friends, "You can't silence me. I'm Judge May." The system tried to forget her, but Clara had done the one thing they feared most. She lit a fire in the people, and that kind of light, it never goes out. And so Clara's story reminds us, justice isn't just about the courtroom. It's about standing up when it's easier to sit down. It's about protecting what's right, even when you're standing alone. Her journey speaks to every quiet voice that's ever been ignored, every truth that's been buried, and every soul that dared to believe that change was possible. Because sometimes, the strongest revolutions begin not with a roar, but with a whisper that refuses to die. If this story moved you, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. We read every one, and your voice matters here. And stay with us, because in our next stories, we'll continue to uncover the hidden battles, the quiet strength, and the breathtaking victories of Black individuals who rise above a world stacked against them. Stories that will open your eyes. Stories you've never heard before, stories that stay with you. We're just getting started.